Women are big children throughout their entire lives. These words came from the mouth of one of the most respected philosophers in Western history. Arthur Schopenhauer not only thought this, he wrote it, published it, and defended this view until the end of his days. But what you are about to discover goes far beyond this controversial statement. The year was 1851. On the streets of Frankfurt, a 63-year-old man walked alone, avoiding any contact with women on the street. When one approached, he would cross to the other side. At restaurants, he always asked for the table farthest from families. At home, he locked the double doors and placed loaded pistols next to his bed, not out of fear of thieves, but because he believed women were capable of anything to destroy a man. This man was Arthur Schopenhauer, and his repulsion toward women was not born of abstract theories. It was born of a wound so deep that it shaped not only his personal life, but also revolutionized Western philosophy in a way few dare to admit today. At 5 years old, Arthur saw his mother, Johanna, publicly humiliate his father during a dinner. Heinrich Schopenhauer, a respected merchant, was reduced to nothing before the guests as Johanna ridiculed him for his intellectual mediocrity. The boy watched his father leave the room in silence, devastated. 3 years later, Heinrich was dead, officially by accident, but Arthur always suspected it was suicide. But there was something about his father's death that Schopenhauer would only discover decades later, something that would completely change his understanding of the destructive power of women. Johanna showed no mourning. On the contrary, she transformed the house into a literary salon where she hosted young writers and artists. Arthur, still a child, watched his mother intellectually seduce these men, seeing them become dependent on her approval, her presence, her calculated smiles. He realized they progressively lost their individuality, their own ambitions, becoming satellites orbiting around Johanna's manipulative luminosity. The first major confrontation happened when Arthur was 25. He had returned from a trip through Europe, where he developed his first philosophical theories. Johanna received him coldly and fired. "You think you are a genius, but you are nothing more than an arrogant young man who has never done anything with his life. Meanwhile, I have built a reputation, I have influence, I am respected. You are nothing." Arthur replied with a phrase that would echo through the rest of his life. "Mother, you don't understand. I have discovered something no man before me has fully understood. Woman is not what she appears to be. She is a force of nature disguised as tenderness." Johanna laughed at him. A cruel laugh that pierced the young philosopher's soul like a blade. "You hate women because you cannot conquer them," she said. "But the problem is not us, Arthur. The problem is you." This humiliation planted a poisonous seed that would grow for decades. Schopenhauer began compulsively observing female behavior, not as an admirer, but as a scientist studying a dangerous phenomenon. He wrote everything down: gestures, words, strategies, patterns. He was building a theory that would shake the foundations of Western philosophy. There was a hidden diary Schopenhauer kept, filled with observations about specific women. When this diary was discovered after his death, it revealed something his biographers tried to hide for over a century. During his 30s, Arthur had some relationships, but they all ended the same way. The woman would begin sweet, understanding, interested in his ideas. Gradually, she would start suggesting small changes in his appearance, his schedule, his priorities. The pattern was always the same: intellectual seduction followed by subtle control, then complete domination. The most devastating was Caroline Richter, a 28-year-old actress. Arthur, then 35, believed he had found his soulmate. Caroline seemed genuinely fascinated by his philosophy, asked intelligent questions, offered relevant insights. For 6 months, Arthur experienced something he had never felt before: completeness. Then Caroline began canceling meetings for important rehearsals. She started subtly criticizing his social isolation. She suggested he should be more practical and less abstract in his ideas. Before Arthur realized it, she had introduced a young actor into her life, someone more suitable for her artistic interests. The betrayal was not sexual, it was existential. Caroline had feigned interest in his mind only to gain access to his emotions, to destroy him from within. At that moment, Arthur understood he had been used as an emotional experiment. But 3 weeks later, Caroline appeared at his home in tears, begging for forgiveness. She confessed it had all been an act, not hers, but orchestrated by her mother, who had planned the entire relationship to gain access to Arthur's financial resources. This revelation was the decisive moment. Arthur realized he was not dealing with individual whims but with a systematic, almost instinctive pattern of female behavior. Women, he concluded, were not malicious by choice. They were unconscious instruments of a greater, more primitive, destructive force. He began to call this force the will to live, a blind impulse of nature that uses female beauty, tenderness, and intelligence as traps to guarantee the reproduction of the species, regardless of the cost to male freedom and individual fulfillment. Schopenhauer began feverishly writing his observations. Each page was an attempt to decipher the code of female behavior, to understand how they could transform independent men into emotional slaves without them even noticing the process taking place. If you are enjoying discovering this hidden side of one of the greatest philosophers in history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You'll be surprised by what's still to come. There existed a letter Schopenhauer wrote but never sent, addressed to a mysterious woman. When it was found decades later, it would reveal the true reason behind all his philosophy about the feminine. Arthur Schopenhauer turned his pain into a scientific method. At 40 years old, he had developed a system of behavioral observation that he applied to every woman who crossed his path. It was no longer philosophy, it was almost a criminal investigation. He cataloged everything into precise categories: phase of initial approach, techniques of intellectual seduction, markers of progressive control, and signs of complete domination. Every woman he met, from maids to aristocrats, was unconsciously studied through this analytical lens. During a trip to Dresden, Arthur stayed in a boarding house run by a widow named Margaret Weber. At 45, she was the opposite of everything he considered dangerous: discreet, practical, seemingly uninterested in emotional games. Arthur lowered his guard. Margaret prepared his favorite meals without him asking. She left fresh flowers in the room. She showed genuine interest in his morning walks and his writing habits. For 2 weeks, Arthur experienced something he hadn't felt in years: domestic peace. Then came the small suggestions. Margaret casually mentioned that he seemed lonely, that a man of his intelligence deserved company, that she had always admired intellectual men, so different from the coarse merchants who frequented her boarding house. Arthur immediately recognized the pattern, but part of him resisted his own analysis. Margaret seemed different. Maybe his theories were exaggerated. Maybe not all women followed the same destructive script. During a dinner, Margaret shared the story of her late husband, a frustrated writer who never managed to publish his novels. "He had talent," she said, "but he lacked the discipline I see in you. If only I had met someone like you back then." The sentence hung in the air like an unspoken promise. Arthur felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: the possibility of being understood, of being valued not despite his peculiarities, but because of them. In the 3rd week, Margaret asked for advice on investments. She had inherited a small sum and didn't know how to use it. Arthur, touched by her trust, offered to help. She accepted with almost reverent gratitude. But something was strange. Margaret asked very specific questions about his routines, his working hours, his dietary preferences. When Arthur questioned the relevance of these details, she explained that she wanted to organize the boarding house according to the needs of her most distinguished guests. One morning, Arthur woke up to find his desk reorganized. Margaret had arranged his papers, putting them in alphabetical order. When he protested, she apologized profusely, saying she only wanted to help. But Arthur realized she had read his personal notes. That same afternoon, Margaret casually commented on his interesting theories about female nature. She laughed delicately, saying she thought it was fascinating how intelligent men sometimes complicate simple matters. Arthur froze. Margaret had read his secret diary. She knew his observations, his conclusions, his deepest vulnerabilities. And she was using this knowledge against him. During dinner, Margaret served wine and began a conversation about male loneliness. She spoke of brilliant men who wasted their lives out of pride, out of fear of truly connecting with others. Sometimes, she said, intelligence can be a prison. Arthur realized he was being manipulated with a sophistication that surpassed any previous experience. Margaret had studied his theories and was applying specific counter-strategies. She was not a victim of unconscious impulses, she was a conscious predator. The most devastating revelation came when Arthur discovered that Margaret maintained regular correspondence with his mother, Johanna. The two women had orchestrated the entire encounter. Johanna had provided detailed information about Arthur's psychological vulnerabilities, and Margaret had created a controlled environment to exploit them. Arthur found the letters hidden in the boarding house office. Johanna wrote, "Arthur has always been susceptible to women who show interest in his mind. Use that. He needs to learn that he cannot escape female nature simply by rejecting it." Margaret replied, "He is progressing well. Yesterday he mentioned the possibility of extending his stay. His defenses are systematically lowering." They were clinical documents, reports of a psychological experiment. Arthur had been reduced to an object of study, his emotions treated as collectible data. That night, Arthur confronted Margaret directly. He placed the letters on the table and waited for an explanation. Margaret denied nothing. On the contrary, she smiled with a coldness Arthur had never seen before. "You think you've discovered something revolutionary about women," she said. "But you don't realize that we have always known exactly what you think of us. Your theories are not insights, they are confessions. You fear us because you know we are more intelligent." Arthur left the boarding house that very night, under torrential rain, carrying only a suitcase. Walking through the deserted streets of Dresden, he realized he had profoundly underestimated the enemy. Women were not unconscious instruments of nature. They were conscious strategists playing a far more complex game than he had imagined. In the following months, Arthur developed what he would call his philosophy of total suspicion. It was not enough to avoid romantic relationships. It was necessary to distrust any interaction with women, no matter how innocent it seemed. He began documenting not only individual behaviors but collective patterns, strategies that seemed to be passed down through generations of women as secret knowledge. His observations became increasingly systematic and, in his own eyes, increasingly scientific. Arthur realized he was developing not only a philosophical theory but also a personal defense system. Each page he wrote was simultaneously intellectual analysis and emotional armor against a world he saw as fundamentally hostile to male freedom. After the Dresden incident, Arthur Schopenhauer isolated himself completely for 2 years. He rented an apartment in Frankfurt am Main, on the 4th floor of a commercial building, chosen specifically because there were no families living there. His only companions were books and a French poodle named Atma, the only living being he still trusted. During this period of extreme seclusion, Arthur made the most disturbing discovery of his life. It was not through new relationships or external observations. It came from obsessively revisiting his childhood memories, applying his analytical methodology to his own traumas. He began systematically reconstructing every interaction between his parents, every word from his mother, every silence from his father. What emerged from this emotional archaeology was a truth so shocking it almost drove him insane. Heinrich Schopenhauer had not died accidentally, nor from impulsive suicide. He had been methodically destroyed by Johanna through a process Arthur now recognized as profoundly systematic. His mother had applied psychological erosion techniques that Arthur only managed to understand decades after witnessing them. Johanna had gradually isolated Heinrich from his merchant friends, ridiculing them as mediocre. She systematically questioned his business decisions, always in a loving and caring way. She introduced into their social life young and charismatic artists, who made Heinrich feel old-fashioned and irrelevant. The final blow had been sexual, but not in the obvious way. Johanna never physically betrayed Heinrich. Instead, she developed intense emotional intimacies with other men in his presence, making him feel excluded from his own married life. Heinrich began to live as an intruder in his own home. Arthur found his father's secret diary, hidden for decades behind the library. The last entries were devastating. "I no longer recognize who I am. Johanna says she loves me, but I feel like I am disappearing. Each day, a part of me dies and she smiles as if this were natural." The final entry, dated 3 days before Heinrich's death, simply said, "I have understood. She does not hate me. She consumes me. And the worst part is that I allow it, because I still believe this is love." Arthur realized he had witnessed not just a destructive marriage, but a practical manual of psychological domination. His mother had been his first teacher in the arts of female manipulation, and it had taken him decades to decipher the lesson. Even more disturbing, Arthur discovered that his own theories about women had been unconsciously shaped by the techniques Johanna had used against him. She had turned her own son into an extension of her vengeance against the male gender. During his obsessive investigations, Arthur made a discovery that changed everything. He found correspondence between Johanna and other women of her time, exchanging marital control strategies like cooking recipes. There was an informal network of knowledge, passed down between mothers and daughters, on how to manage men. A letter from 1798, written by a friend of Johanna, detailed, "The key is never to confront directly. You must make him reach the conclusions you want on his own. Question his certainties with seemingly innocent questions. Praise other men in a way that makes him feel inadequate without you ever criticizing him directly." Another correspondence discussed techniques of social isolation. Turn his friends into rivals. Do not criticize them openly, simply show how you shine in the company of more interesting men. He will begin to avoid them on his own, so as not to feel diminished. Arthur realized he was documenting not individual behavioral deviations, but a sophisticated, widely disseminated cultural system. The women of his time possessed strategic knowledge about male psychology that no man had ever systematized academically. The most devastating moment came when Arthur discovered the letter his mother had written shortly before her death, addressed to a young niece. It was a testament of her discoveries about male domination. "My dear, you must understand that men are paradoxical creatures. They need to feel superior in order to function, but they are fundamentally dependent on our approval. Use this dependency. Never deny it completely, that would make them run away. Never grant it completely, that would make them complacent. Always keep it just slightly out of reach." The letter continued with practical advice that Arthur immediately recognized as the techniques used against him by Caroline, by Margaret, and countless other women. Show interest in his ideas, but always suggest small improvements. Make him feel that you are his intellectual inspiration. Gradually, he will transfer to you the credit for his own thoughts. Arthur realized he had been a continuous experiment since birth. His mother had used her relationship with her son to test and refine manipulation techniques that she later shared with other women. He had been simultaneously victim and laboratory. The final revelation came through an accidental discovery. Arthur found his own name mentioned in Johanna's correspondence. She described her son as a fascinating case study, and detailed how her control techniques had shaped his personality. "Arthur has developed exactly the neuroses I predicted," Johanna wrote to a friend in 1835. "He hates women because he cannot resist them. I have turned him into a man who simultaneously fears and desires us, making him completely predictable." Sitting in his dark apartment, surrounded by decades of notes and discoveries, Arthur Schopenhauer finally understood the magnitude of what he had uncovered. It was not just personal philosophy. It was the archaeology of a power system that operated in the shadows of Western civilization. He took a blank sheet of paper and wrote the sentence that would define his philosophy forever: "Woman is by nature destined to obey." But now he knew that this sentence did not describe submission. It described the perfect disguise for absolute control. Arthur Schopenhauer spent the last 15 years of his life transforming his personal pain into the most controversial philosophical work of the 19th century. But the real question is not whether he said those words about women. It is why he needed to say them, and what this reveals about human nature that we prefer not to face. In 1860, at 72 years old, Arthur received an unexpected visitor. It was Helena Zimmermann, a young philosophy scholar who had read his works and came to challenge his theories about women. She was 28, the same age as Caroline when she had betrayed him decades earlier. Helena arrived at Arthur's apartment armed with logical arguments, precise citations from his own texts, and a determination that surprised him. "Professor Schopenhauer," she said, "you have built an entire philosophy based on generalizations derived from personal traumatic experiences. This is not science, it is disguised therapy." For the first time in decades, Arthur found himself confronted not with seduction or manipulation, but with direct intellectual criticism. Helena did not try to win him over, control him, or hurt him. She simply dismantled his arguments with the same methodological precision he had applied to women. "You claim that women are incapable of genius," Helena continued, "but your own mother built one of the most influential intellectual salons of her time. She did not use charm or seduction, she used pure intelligence. The problem was not that she was a woman. The problem was that she was smarter than your father, and neither of you could ever accept that." Arthur felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: the possibility of being wrong. Not about details or interpretations, but about the fundamental premise of his theories. Helena spent 3 hours systematically destroying each of his central arguments. She demonstrated how his scientific observations were, in fact, biased interpretations of normal behavior. She showed how he had ignored contradictory evidence and distorted data to confirm his pre-established conclusions. "Professor," she finally said, you did not discover female nature. You discovered your own incapacity to process maternal and romantic rejection in a healthy way. When Helena left, Arthur was left alone with a devastating revelation. All of his theories about female manipulation could be projections of his own need for control. He had accused women of being calculating precisely because he himself had turned relationships into experiments, love into methodology, intimacy into research material. During his final weeks of life, Arthur made the most important discovery of his philosophical career. Rereading his own texts with critical eyes, he realized he had perfectly described a real phenomenon, but had misidentified both the cause and the culprits. The problem was not women. The problem was what he called, in his final writings, the predatory nature of human desire. Men and women, he realized, were equally capable of using intimacy as a tool of control. The difference was only in the specific techniques developed by each gender throughout history. Arthur discovered that he had documented not female nature, but patterns of behavior that emerged in societies where women had limited power. Deprived of official authority, they had developed indirect forms of influence. It was not inherent malice, it was intelligent social adaptation. His observations of Johanna, Caroline, Margaret, and others were accurate. But his interpretation had been fundamentally flawed. These women were not unconscious instruments of nature. They were conscious agents navigating a system that denied them direct power. The mysterious letter he had written but never sent was addressed to Helena Zimmermann. In it, Arthur admitted his fundamental errors. Dear Helena, you were right. I turned my personal pain into universal theory, my need for control into scientific analysis. But I discovered something even more important. What I thought was specific to women is, in fact, characteristic of any group excluded from official power. Deprived of direct authority, we all develop indirect strategies of influence. Arthur realized that his own behaviors, the intellectual manipulation, the strategic isolation, the use of philosophy as an emotional weapon, followed exactly the same patterns he had criticized in women. The only difference was that he had rationalized his strategies as philosophy, while condemning theirs as manipulation. The final truth was even more complex. Arthur Schopenhauer had discovered something profound about human nature, but had spent decades trying to universalize something that was specific to his historical and social context. In his final writings, he reformulated his theories. What I called female nature is, in fact, the set of strategies developed by any group that needs to exert influence without formal authority. If men were systematically excluded from direct power for centuries, they would develop exactly the same techniques. This final discovery revealed the most important lesson of his entire philosophical journey. The danger does not lie in specific groups of people, but in systems that force some to seek power through indirect means. When we deny someone legitimate authority, we inevitably create conditions for them to develop illegitimate forms of control. Arthur died in September 1860, leaving specific instructions that his final reflections be published only 50 years after his death. He knew his final discoveries contradicted his established reputation, but he believed that truth should prevail over ego. The devastating moral lesson of Arthur Schopenhauer transcends questions of gender. When we turn our personal wounds into universal theories, we are not doing science. We are perpetuating our own traumas. And when we deny legitimate power to any group, we inevitably create conditions for that group to develop illegitimate forms of influence. Schopenhauer did say those words about women, yes. But his final discoveries revealed that the problem was never women. It was a social system that forced them to seek power through indirect means, and a philosopher who confused social symptoms with biological nature. Schopenhauer's true genius was not in his theories about women. It was in his ultimate capacity to recognize that he was wrong, to question his own most fundamental premises, and to discover universal truths about power, control, and human nature that transcended his limited personal experiences. If you have followed this philosophical journey this far, subscribe to the channel for more content that challenges established truths and reveals the hidden complexities behind history's greatest thinkers. Arthur Schopenhauer's final legacy is not his controversial statements about women. It is proof that even the greatest philosophers can be deeply mistaken when they confuse personal experience with universal truth, and that true wisdom lies in having the courage to recognize and correct our own fundamental errors.